Hey. Wow. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Tallinn. So let's kick it off. So first thing is who am I? My name is Floris Ladan. I'm a strategist at Splunk, and I've been working in security for over 15 years. Started as a pen tester for a consulting firm, and I was like, okay, I can do that. So I can do defense, right? Well, that became difficult. So I joined a large bank and became their one of their first defenders, setting up IDSs, that kind of stuff. And built their first SOC and started really getting into defense. And defense is hard, in some ways harder, because you need to be structured. So yeah, my biggest success is I switched to another company now, and I no longer have to wear a suit. So I'm really happy on that part. The real question is, why listen to me? And I'm good at failing. I failed a lot. I failed building a SOC 3 times. And if MITRE ATT&CK and prioritizing your work is something you already know, at least be entertained in my failures. And beyond that, we'll see what happened. So the first time I built a SOC, I forgot the people. We forgot that we didn't have proper staffing, we didn't have rosters, we didn't have shifts. We didn't have motivated people because they came from all other network monitoring stuff. They came from the cache counting security side. They came from physical security. And then the second time, we said, okay, we'll hire people, we'll do it again. And we failed again because we forgot about the processes. We didn't have a mandate. People came to us, why are you unplugging my PC? Well, it's for the viruses. Yeah, sure, but I can still keep working, go away. Okay, lesson learned. We needed a mandate, a mission, a vision. We needed to keep having budget. And we needed time to figure out what we had to do. Because one of the things we did, we tried to implement everything. We tried to implement all the use cases we could find. And that had its own problems. But the third time, actually, we figured out what we had to do. We figured out how to train the people. And we figured out the process we needed to keep running. And that time, we actually succeeded. And the question is, how do you know what you need to do? Because we started using security frameworks, because there was so much work coming at us. What do we need to manage? So how do we use those frameworks? We started reading all of them, and that wasn't a success. We implemented some controls, but we couldn't do everything. And we started mapping actors, threats, skill change, making our own frameworks, and that got us further. But the real question always was, how do we know what controls we actually need? And that's what this slide is getting into. So, but before we go into how to do this, let's go into the history of security frameworks first, because we have two types of framework. We've got the management frameworks, and this is for information security managers. It's lots of policies for access control. It's lots of ISO 27001, and you've got the Sun Sys 20. You've got all these controls, and there are a lot of work to implement. But they don't tell you anything about monitoring. They don't tell you anything about how to deal, what use cases should be where, etc. So we move beyond there. Security detection frameworks are a subset of that. It doesn't tell you how to protect everything, but it will tell you how to start building your detections. And the first thing we started out with was, actually some of them you might know, but the first one we started out with was the OODA loop. So the OODA loop is written by John Boyd. And John Boyd was a fighter pilot in the Korean War, and he wrote a book called The Discourse of Winning and Losing. And it was aimed at a couple of strategies, mainly at observe, what are you seeing? Orient, where am I? In John's case, in relation to the plane, in the cyber defender, in relation to the attack, what's happening where, be aware of all those surroundings. Based on that, make a decision on how you're going to go forward, decide, and then do it, act. It's great, it's really real, but this was one of the first frameworks we encountered in cybersecurity. It told us how to act rational. It didn't tell us what to do. So we had something else. Lockheed Martin, of course, came along with the cyber kill chain. And for those of you who didn't know, the cyber kill chain was built as a response to the RSA attack. And in that case, Lockheed Martin was attacked by means of compromise to the RSA token. They got hacked, and the attackers got away with their IP. And IP is critical for these companies because these are their inventions. This is national security. This is going to be the next future of tech that the future wars will be fought with. So that was critical. And the good thing they did, they started making this high-level framework where they focused on recon, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, etc. So these high-level categories that we could at least start grouping our use cases in. Because at that time, I had multiple rules running, multiple systems running. And I didn't make a distinction if it was an antivirus rule or a net rule or any other detection. So making that distinction and making this framework in a strategic way helped us to at least start splitting out those use cases. There's one problem. The first thing, of course, weaponization. It's a nice step. Any attacker does it. But I haven't seen anyone write a defense against that. You can't write a detection against something an attacker prepares on his own PC. So it starts to crumble a bit there. The other pattern we're seeing here is that these were all based on intelligence. And I was working, on military applications. So based on the confidentiality of the information, keeping it secret. I was working in finance. My goal was mainly keeping it integer, keeping it as it is, make sure nothing gets changed. Because if somebody changes information for a bank, that could be having bigger consequences than leaking information. Luckily, we had some influx in 2013. Katie Nichols, one of the first speakers, came forth with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. And the MITRE ATT&CK Framework took part of the Lockheed Martin kill chain and post-compromise started building out the tactics that are beneath that. So that helped us focusing to the next set of granularity, which is great. And everybody's working now with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. For the ones of you who don't know, I'll go over it briefly. But the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, 12 tactics, over 500 techniques. This is an old slide of mine. I think a couple of years ago I wrote 257. We're now at 573 from the top of my head. It's expanded to techniques, sub-techniques. So that's great. And the first thing you do is if you get a framework like this, which tells you everything you can do, is you implement all the use cases, right? No? No. Because what you do, if you build this really great complex machine, you enable all the use cases out of the box for any security tool you have. You get overwhelmed. You get thousands of alerts. And if you get thousands of alerts, you get thousands of incidents to handle, you get thousands of things to investigate, and you can't do that. Remember, an average SOC analyst can investigate 8 to 16 alerts a day. So you need to have an incredible team to manage that. The other thing is that you're managing people, and these people get overwhelmed. We're trying to hire the people who are in this room here. We're trying to hire the digital detectives. We're trying to hire the cyber professionals, people who are interested in puzzling, solving a puzzle, a repetitive puzzle, a non-repetitive puzzle. And if you give people who like puzzling repetitive work, alert after alert, day after day, day after day, they will leave. It's a terrible job. So we didn't only need to get rid of the alerts, we needed to make sure we had the right alerts which were worth following up. So yeah, and that's the thing that we need to look at as well. So of the use cases and techniques, implementing all of them is an all-you-can-eat buffet. You can't eat everything on that menu. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't give you a good time. And by the way, you might not even like fish. So it's the same with use cases. If you are protecting an organization and you know you're not running Windows, then stop focusing on the Windows detections. Now this is a simple example, but it continues and it works out for every subset in that attack. Figure out what you need to do, because bigger is not always better. The real goal is tailoring these use cases. Get the suit that fits, not the biggest suit. So now we come to a choice. The paradox of choices. Which detections should you choose? The most popular ones? I mean, everybody's going after Log4j exploits. That was hot, still hot. Everybody has it in their demos. Sure, go for that one. Maybe you should use the ones for the data sources you already have. You might already have network data. Let's start with those, because that's at least something we can do. Or the ones your CISO will appreciate. I mean, everybody like us is trying to make a career, right? Be in the limelight. Or we'll do something else. We'll use a structured approach based on research and common knowledge. So, and that's a better way to communicate of what you're doing. Because if you start focusing on the highlights, you're going to keep running. So you need to get some kind of structure in. Now there's a couple of ways to prioritize that. You can focus on the brand new threats, everything coming out, you can focus on that. Secondly, you can focus by technique. So for example, there's a technique which 200 threat groups are using. Well, that's the one I should be focusing on first. That also has a merit. It's at least better than focus on the new shiny threat, which just came up yesterday. And later is look at industry mapping. And that's the real part where you start tailoring what you're doing to who you are and who you need to be protecting. If you work in finance, you should be afraid of the groups targeting finance. And then the fourth one is take a look at the techniques seen in the wild. If you can split down to that level, focus on which techniques have been observed. And there's a great project which we'll go into, which is the MITRE Ingenuity Adversary Sightings project, and we'll dive into that a bit. Lastly, top attacks, which is a new methodology from MITRE, and anything you can find for third parties. That's also a solution. I would not really recommend that, to just get a top hits and start running detections for that. So for the first methodology, the brand new critical threats. And the problem is some threats just come out of nowhere, so you need to focus on those. If Log4Shell comes out, if Hafnium comes out, there was no warning. There was not a lot you could do about it except start running. So at some point, you're always at the mercy of going into defense for whatever comes up. And you can follow your threat vendors from those. I work for a company who has a threat feed and threat post. You can implement automatically or manually to get those detections running. Now, if the firefighting part is done and you get back to your normal work, you can start thinking about popularity. Which threats are the most popular? So what should I be implementing? Focusing on malicious file, we've seen it the most. Maybe focusing on spear phishing. So this helps. This is a broad net you're casting there. And what you get from that is a good result. But it's not tailored to what you can be doing best. The second thing is that the MITRE ATT&CK Framework focuses on threat reports, and it really provides a data set which is enriched with which APT groups go for what technologies and where they've been observed. If you've worked with the MITRE ATT&CK Explorer, you can load layers in there, you can view overlays for these threats. So now you're starting diving into attackers in a general way. Which attacker does what? But it doesn't say how often this attack occurs. So we're still doing a general filtering. The second thing which I think starts to focus on who am I and what am I trying to protect, take a look at industry mapping. If you work in finance, there are some Korean and North Korean actors you need to be watching out for. They're not as active anymore. If you work in the defense industry, if you work in high tech, other types of actors apply. So figure out which groups are targeting your companies, or the company in the sector you're working for, actually. And then it starts to get you more guidance on what to pick. The newest thing which I really enjoyed was a project running since 2019. The MITRE Ingenuity Adversary Sightings project. It was a list made with data from, amongst others, Red Canary. For those of you who don't know, Red Canary runs a sort of open source sandbox, detections on attacks. And they were able to collect over 6 million sightings of adversary behavior. It ran from April 2019 to July 2021. And in that time, they got 1.1 million observed techniques in the wild. That's great. We finally know what, on average, is coming in and is being exploited. So we're getting a real feel of what attackers are doing in our environments. And we can go through the list, and there's not going to be much surprises, because this is, again, a general top list being used. So if you have ever done attack response, you'll find these top listings there. There's also stuff like living off the land on there, there's legitimate files, there's signed binary execution, it's the usual stuff. But what it does, it allows you, and it allowed MITRE, to get you a calculator. And I invite everybody to play with that MITRE attack techniques calculator. It allows you to fill out what defenses you have, how well you're monitoring your network, how well are you monitoring your endpoints, how well are you monitoring your gateways, your cloud services, etc. And based on your own rating, you get a list of customized attacks back. So that's great. Now we have something that we can start working on based on the data from there. How do they calculate this? What they do is they take a look at prevalence, how much an attacker uses a specific MITRE attack over time. They take a look at choke points, and we'll get into choke points in a bit, but it's a point where attacks converge. We'll take a look at actionability. There might be a very often used attack, but it can't be detected upon, so they also rate that part. And that will give you a list of top techniques. The cool thing is that with this list of top techniques, we can start focusing on what's important to us. But first take a look at the data there. So if we take a look at the prevalence, we can see that attacks have been occurring over the almost 2 years that this project was running. But what the prevalence also means is that if an attack has been popular in the last couple of months, we're giving it a higher rating. It's been given a higher rating than if it's been running 2 years ago. Because if it was really active 2 years ago, it doesn't mean it still applies to us now. And then the second thing is if you have your prevalence, you know what's been recently important, you can also move on to the best place to start detecting. Take a look at choke points. If you remember the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, you had the tactics in a vertical column, the techniques horizontal. If you can imagine your attacker going through that, they will make a chain of attacks. Now there's certain points in this matrix where they will have no option. They will go via 1, maybe 2 techniques in order to move further in their total attack. These are what's called choke points. So for example, in this case, process injection is somewhere, is a choke point they will always use. So if I monitor process injection, I don't have to monitor create process with token or resource hijacking that much, because process injection is the place the attacker will always pass through. I'm not saying don't do anything. I'm saying this is a very effective technique to focus on, because it's identified as a choke point here. The second thing is actionability. It's the opportunity for a defender to detect or mitigate a technique based on the available analytics or controls. So in simpler ways, it can be separated into two categories, detections or mitigations. And based on publicly available resources, on the amount of controls and detections, we can calculate what's weighted more heavily or less heavily. And there's a number of ways of doing that. There's the MITRE Cyber Analytic Repository. There's rules from Elastic, from Sigma. Splunk has their detections as well, and with or the NIST controls. And with those, there's also a calculator you can start using from the Ingenuity project to start calculating these the actionability of those. Now, the first thing is, of course, the methodology for prioritization, and this is where Red Canary has given us a great view of what's happening most often. And if you start putting these all together, it means that we're going to start with the MITRE framework. We're going to add a point for every threat actor that uses a particular technique. And then we subtract a point for every detection that's mapped to that technique. And what comes out of that is a weighted detection map. So we take into account existing coverage. Where have we got rules? Now in this case, I've taken my own company's detections, because I can't be running around with customer or any other company's detections. So this is what we develop. And based on the rules, we started to focus on the areas where risk is high. And then on the opposite part of that, using the threat group data, we add points for every threat group that uses a particular technique. And we subtract another point for where we have a detection map to that. And what we get out of that is a map on what we need to prioritize. And as you can see, there's really a map there of what turns dark red is where we haven't got detections, but we're seeing it in the wild recently. So we should be starting to focus our effort there. Really start building this one first. This is what's critical for us. There's one thing to consider. Don't focus on it too much, because attack coverage does not mean completeness. So if a user develops a mechanism to see if a process has been injected, and you know that you've got a detection on your EDR solution, you might not have covered your server landscape, because servers are not usually running EDR. It cuts back on performance, it causes weird issues. So if you're running EDR, don't think you're fully protected. You're protected on only your desktop landscapes. So it focuses on compliance, but you need to keep thinking about completeness. Is every detection running on my entire organization? So that would be all servers, all containers, all endpoint clouds, etc. And for a conclusion, your time is limited. So you need to figure out what brings you value. Don't be the kid in the candy shop. Just because you get a tool, just because you get a shiny EDR, a shiny IDS, a shiny XDR, whatever comes out, don't take the use cases for granted. Think if they're applicable. It seems easy to turn them on, but every tool, every rule, every detection you run needs to be maintained. Use a structured approach. You need to run sometimes. Everybody needs to run for the next new threat coming out. But at some point, you need to sit back, think about top down, what's the work done, and don't start from scratch. Don't start from scratch. Use MITRE, use the ATT&CK Framework for as much as you can. Coverage is not completeness. If you only have a tool running on part of the organization, focus on, don't forget that other parts of your organization might still be applicable. A tool like the maximise security framework helps with that, because it asks you to assess your coverage. And don't focus on detection and monitoring, because security starts at good security design. You need prevention, you need mitigation, you need user training, and that's all crucial in running a proper SOC. And with that, I see I've gone way, way, way too fast. But thanks for listening to this Extreme Lightning talk. There's a link here, and I've QR coded it. It leads to our company's GitHub page, where we describe how to do these detections, how to calculate this, and also run how to do adversary calculations against the MITRE framework. So thanks for that.
You did really fast talk, and there was a lot of links, basically. I think kind of like each of the slides, if I would click the link, would take me, I don't know, hour to read or something like that, hour to read probably, and then a couple of hours to try to implement. Are the slides also somewhere on behind the QR code, or do you share them?
I think I can share them with you guys. Is that an option?
Okay. Yeah, because I know people have been asking in audience that are the slides shared. It depends on a particular presenter if the slides are kind of things they want to share, but I hope this one is, because it's like, I was kind of like, I can't take enough snapshots to find the URLs later, so.
I was hoping we could share it somewhere on the BSides page.
I think it's very good, because it's something I definitely put into my reading list. So, do we have on the end of the fast presentation some questions also? Do we have a microphone lady? Yes, microphone lady is ready, but I don't see any hands. There is a hand, yeah. And as always, the best question will get the possibility to get some merch from back there. So please, before your question, if there is a next one wanting to ask question, raise your hand so I or somebody can bring you the mic. Yeah, next mic is going there. So, yeah. So, sorry, please.
You started your talk about failure-free time-making SOC. What was the time frame? I mean, the cycles.
Yeah, the time frame was 9.5 years, almost 10. About 3 years per SOC. And the first thing we did was a IDS solution, and that needed some assistance. And then we started on other antivirus tooling, data loss prevention tooling. And then you get overwhelmed because your day starts with 5 tools. And the new technique came along called the seam, and that started helping. So, and it is really a slow process. And nowadays, there's better books to read. There's crafting the InfoSec book, which I really recommend. There's a bunch of stuff to read when setting up a SOC. And I'm happy for that because it means that people get used to the frameworks. And there's, of course, stuff like MITRE, which is really, really nice, which I'm finally starting to like because it's no longer the view that you have to do everything, which nobody can do. It used to be an eternal project every day, getting more MITRE detections in. And so, yeah, in about 3 years, we built the first environment, and that crashed because for some reason we got a small business environment, and you can't run a global bank with that. The second thing we did was hire more people, which is great, but then suddenly, yeah, I was 25, I had a team to manage, which is also getting you into new problems. There's a saying, I wish you lots of staff, and it's not a compliment, it's an insult. And that turned out to be true, because you needed to do a lot more. So by the time we had that ready, we were also almost 3 years later, and we started again. And the third SOC we implemented was the one which kept running. We had shifts, we had rosters, we had games, we had team outings, because you need to keep yourself and people happy and interesting. Stuff like hackathons, stuff like the social experience around that was critical to keep the SOC running, and that's something I learned in the 3 years before that. And then when I left, I started with 3 people. I was the 4th. When I left, I think we were 65, so that shows a bit of the growth that, of course, every SOC went through, but I had the luxury of growing with that.
Thanks. I think the next mic is already there.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the great talk. My question is more towards the Splunk strategy, because you have highlighted the importance of people and processes in SOCs. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you empower these core things for SOC with Splunk tools?
With Splunk tools, yeah. So great question. I wasn't in the. I originally had a demo planned, but I'm not in a situation where I can do a demo here live. But there is an app used for guidance and learning called Security Essentials. It contains the MITRE ATT&CK Explorer, and it allows you not only to view the rules you have enabled that you're running, it also allows you to view these attacks by attack group. So in that tool, when we have an update, we update the attack groups, we update the prevalence as much as we can to reflect, because it needs to be a small piece of software. And then we push that out to the app. Now, the app will guide you. So you can select the sector you're working in, you can select the threat groups you're looking at, and you can select the priority weight from the Red Canary research.
Thanks. Any more questions? Because, yeah, did you see somebody? Okay.
Yeah, I told you this was going to be a talk about me failing, and this is me failing to have a 45-minute talk in 45 minutes. So
you probably tried to out-to me and speed talking. So
yeah.
But, is Splunk now protected from spear phishing attachments? That was one of the techniques you had in Red.
Is Splunk protected?
Yeah, I think you had a slide about your coverage of.
Oh no! So what we see is that we have been focusing our last attacks from when we made that analysis. Then we started focusing a lot of attacks on spear phishing analysis as well. So the new detections we've written out are grouped in what we call an analytic story, and that story was around spear phishing and phishing. So that's how our research team figures out what to do. And that's also how we started the idea of matching this and weighing this around. I think there was a question there somewhere.
So I have a following question that once you have set up your MITRE ATT&CK monitoring tool, so to speak, your detections, and we all know that SOC is a continuous process, so you have to keep track of the detections you already have, detections you need to implement, and detections that may not longer be as relevant.
Yeah.
How do you keep track of those, and how do you continuously do that?
Yeah, that's a cool question. So there's two things you need to monitor when working in a SOC. Firstly, and primarily, is the incident life cycle. If an alert goes off, someone needs to pick it up, it needs to be investigated and closed, and not be lying around. That's what we call the incident life cycle. The second one is the use case or detection life cycle. That needs to be a continuous improvement, and it starts with hunting. It starts with research, it starts with news, whatever you can get your input on the newest type of threats. So you need to take that information. Let's say there's a new TTP, there's a new IOC, etc. You start developing or searching in your environments. Where can I find evidence for this? Where can I find this data? Am I finding it in the right places? Can I refine this search? Can I exclude the stuff which is false positive? And you might, for this manual work, get a result. That's great. You've now found this needle in the haystack. Based on that, you don't want to be doing this same work every day because, of course, smart people in a SOC, no repetitive work. So you're going to take that search, you're going to put it into a detection, into an alert. You're going to make sure it runs regularly. It's going to keep running, and it's not going to be perfect. The world changes, you might have made a mistake which you haven't seen over the last time you were searching. It starts triggering true positive, but also false positives. So you need to start tuning. You get back to tuning, you get back to refining. You might even get back to hunting because you need to improve something again. And at that point, you need to decide, am I keeping this use case or am I throwing this away? So that's the use case of a life cycle. That's the life cycle of a use case. And with that life cycle, you need to determine at what point that use case needs to be phased out. So that's the second process running. And together, the first process makes sure everything gets handled. The second process makes sure that everything you're optimizing keeps being optimized. Because you are right, it never stops. It never stops tuning, it never stops refining, it never stops improving in a SOC.
So, as understood correctly, one process for managing an individual detection lifecycle and separate process for managing all the detection life cycles continuously.
No, there's an entire, well, there's multiple ways to skin a cat. I'm not going to tell you how to run your SOC, but I can tell you how I did it. We had one process running to make sure incidents get handled in a good way. We had another process running which makes sure that every, well, it was 2.5 weeks, we had a review of a set of use cases. Because every use cases we analyzed if they were handled correctly or not. We took that information, we took that together with the true false positive rates, and we figured out what we needed to start tuning. So that was a second process where we used to take a chunk of use cases each time and refine those. And there we figure out if we still wanted them, if we need to improve them or discard them.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Any next hands? Or do I get also a question? I wanted actually to ask one question myself also. Namely, you have been in different sizes of SOCs, starting from whatever, 3 persons or 265 and so on. And probably the kind of like, let's say, the conceptual level you are working on these is different. Like if you have one IT guy, you are probably just watching that people's passwords are kind of like somewhat strong, and if you have 65 people, you probably can do a lot of things. But do you see some kind of a size of SOC or security team where actually going deeper into the MITRE ATT&CK matrix is actually relevant, where you have how much people do you need to make this actually graspable?
It's interesting. I did a presentation recently with a slide focusing on the sizes of SOC teams compared to their organizations. Mm-hmm. It appears that there's a large number of smaller organizations who just have 1 or 2 people running. And then you're usually in firefighting mode. You can't run a SOC, you can maybe prevent the worst and accept the risk that something bad happens on the rest. Larger organizations get a chance to grow onto 3 people, 4 people, maybe even 5. And with that amount of monitoring, you can do daily workday monitoring. You can't do 24/7. At that level is the first level where you can start to take a break, take a breather, take a step back and start focusing on what you need to be doing. Because that's the first level where you can step out of firefighting mode and you can start a structured approach. It used to be that this was the minimum level for a SOC. What we're seeing now more and more that people are automating their work away. And I'm really happy with that because my mantra is don't have smart people do repetitive work. So automate away the boring stuff. And we're seeing that if more gets automated, people get in the luxury of working on their own strategy, of working on their own priorities. And that's where this comes into play. Now, looking at the rest of the SOCs, if you're looking to the larger corporations, multiple thousands of users, then you get SOCs spanning into 20 people or sometimes even more. Now, those SOCs certainly have their own entire security organization surrounding that. They might have separate use case teams next to the operations teams, which is interesting because you get competitive. One team wants to create alerts, and the other team wants as little alerts as possible. So you've now just created a conflict in your SOC. But with that, and those are the customers which I see working most of the time with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. And those were also the ones 2 years ago, 3 years ago, which tried to implement all the use cases.
So 20 up.
Yeah, 20 up. And then there were some, the Gartner research had some outliers. One company reported 10,000 SOC analysts, which I don't think is true, but who knows?
Minions probably.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Because I have one more, and I'm not competing for the merge. Just my second question is that I think you mentioned possibly in talk, but maybe yesterday when we were talking that you kind of created, let's say, not similar or your own framework before the MITRE ATT&CK. How do you now compare that to today's life and MITRE? What did you do, and I don't know how much different it was? Do you feel it was kind of inferior, or was it just going in different strategical direction, or and what was it? Is it still somewhere available?
It's still available.
Is it the MAGMA? Or?
The MAGMA use case framework is still available. It's published by the Dutch Payment Association. Don't try to read it as another MITRE attack. It is not. It's not a comprehensive lexicon of every attack technique observed or every tactic observed. What it is a framework to start monitoring your effectiveness as a SOC. So it asks you for every use case you're running, why are you running this? What business purpose? What higher category? So for example, if you're running a rule for DDoS, why are you running that? You need to protect your company. You need to protect your company for downtime. You need to keep sales running. Now, if that's an important thing for your business, then yes, do those use cases. If it's not, don't do them. There's companies who don't care about their website going down because they deliver water. If they deliver water, they care about water quality, not about a website. Then the second thing is that framework also helps you calculate the weight of the use cases or detections you're running. And that's the last slide I had. If you think you're protected because you have an EDR, and the EDR is only running on 10 systems of your 1,000 people organization, you're not being protected. You're protected you're protected 0.1%. And lots of organizations make the mistake saying, if I have a tool somewhere, even if I don't manage it, even if it covers only half of my organization, it's perfect. But there's a lot of work which can be done. And that's the difference between the MAGMA framework and the big lexicon that's MITRE.
And coming back to my first question, would the MAGMA be actually something to start if you're like a SOC of 3 persons or small, so before you kind of like graduate to the larger guys' playground? So because I hear the word use case, and it's probably much more related to what people in smaller companies are dealing than with all of the threat actors who are probably not looking for us small guys so much.
No, use cases are the most abused term in security. There's a use case which could be a reason for acquiring a product. There's a use case which somebody says, no, I need to have my business running. But there's also when, as a SOC analyst, you talk on a use case, you talk all about a detection rule. So it's a really abused term. If you're running 3 people in a small organization, I would focus on a proper management of an EDR solution. That's about the most you can do. You might be able to do some phishing, if you're lucky, and some antivirus, and that's usually quite the limit that you have to do, because if you're 3 persons, you're mostly also managing the firewalls and routers. You're also mostly managing the Windows servers. So you see that with the size that small, don't start. If you get into 5-person SOCs, 10-person SOCs, then you get this luxury to start thinking of who am I, what am I trying to defend, and how to approach that, whichever framework you choose.
Great. Do we have more questions from the audience?
I think not.
No, then first, thank you to you. There is a goodie bag for you, but you also need to, thanks. But you also need to pick one of the questions, not mine, but from the audience.
Yeah.
Which might have been kind of like the best one. And then we need to remember who asked that. So.
No, I think the last question we had on how do you tune it, how do you manage the life cycle of a detection, I thought was a really good question, because it's something most people don't think about, and they just keep running after the detection. So somebody's been thinking about how do I manage this at a constructive way before I need to start running again and miss my after parties. So to the man over there, I think with the yellow shirt, congratulations.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.